Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Glad you could join us. You're here, I know, because you want to get right to the heart of complex stuff quickly, thoroughly. Today, we're really diving into something fundamental, student free speech in schools. It can seem complicated. We're going to try and cut through some of that, get to the core ideas, starting with, well, a really famous Supreme Court case.
That's right. We're focusing today on Tinker v. Des Moines, 1969. This case, it really set the stage, It drew some important lines for First Amendment rights inside schools. Think about the time, late 60s, deep divisions over the Vietnam War. And in Iowa, some students decided to protest silently. They planned to wear black armbands, simple black armbands.
Okay, so let's unpack this a bit. It wasn't like a loud protest or anything, just a symbol, worn quietly.
Exactly, a silent, passive expression. But the school officials found out about the plan, and they made a specific rule just before banning the armbands if students wore them. Suspension.
And that's what happened. The students, Mary Beth Tinker, John Tinker, Christopher Eckhart, they wore them anyway.
They did. They wore them, got suspended, and their parents sued. They argued, basically, that the school violated their kids' right to free speech.
And this went all the way up to the Supreme Court.
All the way. And the court's decision, well, that's the real key takeaway for us today. They said something really memorable. Students don't shed their constitutional rights to freedom of speech or expression at the schoolhouse gate.
Ah, okay. That's the famous line.
Yep.
So you walk into school, you still have free speech rights. But I'm guessing it's not quite that simple, right? There have to be limits.
Oh, definitely limits. The court laid out what we now call the Tinker test.
Right.
Basically, schools can restrict student speech, but only if the speech would cause a material and substantial disruption to how the school runs.
Material and substantial disruption.
Or if it infringes on the rights of other students. And the key thing in Tinker was the court found the armbands didn't do that. They were silent, passive. The school couldn't actually show, any real disturbance happening because of them.
So it's about the actual impact, not just that someone might disagree or be offended. It feels like the court was protecting the expression itself, unless it genuinely messed with the school day.
That's a good way to put it. Protecting the expression unless it demonstrably interfered with the school's job educating kids. Now, it wasn't unanimous. There was a dissent, raising concerns about, subtle discipline, maintaining order, and that tension between student rights and school order, that pops up again and again.
Right. And didn't Tinker also mention an older case, something about flag salutes? Barnett?
Yes, West Virginia State Board of Education v. Barnett. That's crucial context. In Barnett, the court said schools can't force students to say something they don't believe, like compelling a flag salute. Tinker is kind of the flip side. It suggests students can voluntarily express their views as long as it's not disruptive. So, compelled speech is out, but voluntary, non-disruptive speech, generally protected.
Okay, so Tinker gives us this baseline. Rights exist, but they can be limited by substantial disruption. Now, how does this play out in other situations? Like Bethel v. Frazier. That involved a student speech, too, but it sounds different.
Very different. Frazier involved a student giving a speech at an assembly, and it was full of, sexual metaphors, pretty explicit innuendo. He got suspended, and the court actually sided with the school in that case.
So wait, student speech, school discipline, but a totally different outcome than Tinker. Why? How did the court square that? Did they just ignore Tinker?
No, not ignore it, but they distinguished it. They drew a line. They said Frazier's speech wasn't like the political statement in Tinker. It was considered lewd, indecent, offensive. The court felt it was disruptive, not in a noisy way maybe, but disruptive to the school's basic educational mission, teaching students, appropriate behavior, civility.
Ah, okay. So the nature of the speech mattered hugely. Political versus lewd. And the court basically said schools have more leeway to regulate offensive or inappropriate speech than purely political speech.
Exactly. The Frazier court made a point of saying student rights aren't automatically the same as adult rights in other places. Schools can prohibit vulgar and offensive language, even if it's not technically obscene in a legal sense. It's about the school environment.
Got it. So Tinker protects the quiet political statement. Frazier says schools can step in when speech is, plainly offensive and undermines their job. Makes sense. What about Hazelwood? Hazelwood v. Kuhlmeyer. That was the school newspaper one, right?
That's the one. Adds another wrinkle. Here, the principal deleted articles from the student paper. The articles were about teen pregnancy and divorce, sensitive topics.
And the student journalists argued Tinker protected their right to publish.
They did. But the court, again, distinguished Hazelwood from Tinker. This is important. They said the school newspaper wasn't like the personal armbands in Tinker. It wasn't just individual expression. It was part of the school's curriculum, a school-sponsored activity.
Ah, so the school's name was kind of on it, like they were endorsing the message.
Well, precisely. Because it was school-sponsored, the court said the school had more control. They could regulate the content based on legitimate pedagogical concerns. Basically, valid educational reasons, like protecting student privacy or ensuring the material was appropriate for the audience.
So the forum makes a difference. Personal expression like an armband gets the Tinker test, but school-sponsored stuff like a newspaper. Schools have more authority to control the message.
You nailed it. It's a different standard than just substantial disruption. It's about whether the school has a good educational reason to censor.
Okay, this is building a clearer picture. Let's talk about Morse v. Frederick. The Bong Hits for Jesus banner. That one definitely caught headlines. How does that fit in with Tinker?
Well, Morse is another case where the court sided with the school, allowing discipline for student expression. The connection, again, is that it involves student speech and school rules. But the distinguishing factor, the message itself.
Bong Hits for Jesus. Not exactly subtle.
Not subtle, no. And the court interpreted it as promoting illegal drug use. They ruled that schools have a compelling interest in preventing illegal drug use among students. So even though it happened off school grounds, technically it was at a school-sanctioned event, and the message directly undermined the school's anti-drug mission.
So it wasn't just disruptive like Tinker or lewd like Frasier or school-sponsored like Hazelwood. It was seen as advocating illegal activity.
That was the key. Promoting illegal drugs went against a fundamental part of the school's responsibility to keep students safe and discourage illegal behavior. So again, the content and context led to a different outcome than Tinker's protected political speech.
Okay, let's shift gears slightly. Texas v. Johnson. Flag burning. Obviously not in a school. But it's about symbolic speech, just like the armbands in Tinker, right? What's the link there?
Great connection. Both Tinker and Johnson deal with actions as speech, symbolic speech. Johnson strongly affirmed that burning the flag in that context was expressive conduct protected by the First Amendment. It used a test from an earlier case, Spence v. Washington, about whether you intend to send a message and if others are likely to understand it.
So both cases recognize actions can be speech, but the big difference is setting.
Setting is huge. Johnson involved an adult protesting in public. General First Amendment rules apply more broadly there. Tinker established symbolic speech rights for students in schools where, as we've seen with Frasier, Hazelwood, and Morse, the rules are different. Schools get more leeway. So Johnson reinforces the idea of symbolic speech generally, but Tinker is about how that applies within the school gates.
Right, the school context keeps getting back as the critical factor. Okay, one more connection. Snyder v. Phelps. The Westboro Baptist Church protests, extremely offensive speech. How does a case like that relate back to student speech in Tinker?
Well, Snyder also involves that tension we talked about, free speech versus causing harm or offense. Deep, deep offense in this case. The church picketed near a soldier's funeral with truly awful signs. But the court protected their speech. Why? Because they found it related to matters of public concern, broader issues about politics, religion, society.
Even though it caused immense private pain.
Even then. The court drew on cases like New York Times v. Sullivan, distinguishing between public issues and purely private attacks or concerns. Now, compare that to the school cases. Snyder involves adults in a public space near a private event, but still public access, talking about public issues. Tinker is students in school. Frasier and Morse involve speech deemed harmful within the specific educational context, lewdness, undermining civility, or promoting illegal drugs. That wasn't seen as assessing matters of public concern in the same way.
So the public concern aspect was key in Snyder, and that wasn't really the deciding factor in the student cases like Frasier or Morse.
Exactly. While Tinker protected political speech, which is a matter of public concern, the later school cases carved out exceptions based on factors more specific to the school environment, lewdness, school sponsorship, illegal drug advocacy. Snyder operates under the broader First Amendment rules for public speech by adults.
Okay, I think I'm getting a handle on this.
Yeah.
Tinker is like the starting point. Students have rights, period. But then Frasier, Hazelwood, Morse, they sort of refine it. They show where the lines are drawn inside the school. It depends on what you say, where you say it, personal versus school paper, and how it impacts the school's job.
That's a perfect summary. Tinker's core principal rights don't stop at the gateholds. but it's not absolute. Later cases create these, call them exceptions or different standards for different situations: disruption, lewdness, school sponsorship, illegal acts. And cases like Johnson and Snyder, while relevant for context on free speech generally, they highlight how different the rules can be outside the unique school setting.
So wrapping this up, the big takeaway is Tinker v. Des Moines gave students a voice, constitutionally speaking, in schools. But the courts have since clarified that this voice isn't unlimited. The material and substantial disruption test is still key for personal expression, but schools have other tools, other justifications for regulating speech depending on the circumstances.
Precisely. The landscape is nuanced, shaped by all these cases building on, and sometimes limiting, the Tinker precedent.
It really makes you think, doesn't it? How do schools manage this today? I mean, with social media, online speech, the schoolhouse gate feels almost meaningless sometimes.
It's a huge challenge, and maybe that's the thought to leave our listeners with. Thinking about Tinker in these later cases, how should schools balance protecting student expression with keeping things safe and educational, especially now in the digital age? Are these frameworks, developed mostly before the internet really took off, are they still enough? Or do we need, new ways of thinking about it?
That's a really important question. Something definitely worth mulling over. Hopefully this deep dive gives everyone a solid foundation for thinking about those ongoing debates. Thanks so much for joining us on the deep dive.